Ma'am, rejoin ചെയ്യാനാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you.
Still can't hear them. Don't know what to do. Says MacBook Air phone is the.
Your speaker's not working.
Huh?
Your speaker's not working. That's the problem.
Why?
Look, they should play a little test audio. It's not playing. That means your speaker's not working.
അത് ഊരിയിട്ടാണ് ഏതോ ഒരു
I
സാധനം
can
ഊരി
hear you now. I can hear you. So can I just check my PowerPoint? Oh my, I still can't hear. Ayush, it went off again.
No, ma'am, we are here.
Oh, okay, I can hear you. That's right. Okay,
Okay, ma'am.
I'm just
Okay,
going to
fine.
check
It's fine.
I'll just go to
It's
check
fine.
my PowerPoint just to make sure that it's working.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah, it's working. You can see this, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just stop sharing. That's okay. Okay.
Ma'am, you are muted.
Oh yeah, I was just trying to not make noise here.
Okay, ma'am. Jacob sir, we can start now.
and Research Department of the English Newman College, Prebombing. Now, I request the head of the department, Dr. Nishma Thomas, to introduce the speaker of the keynote session.
Good evening, everybody. Respected Principal Dr. Thomas Joseph, Vice Principal Reverend Dr. Tdpza, Reverend Father Paul Carrick, Bressa, highly esteemed resource person of the day, Dr. Chandrima Chakraborty, my dear colleagues, research scholars, and my dear students. Welcome to the session 13 of Online International Conference on Oising Region, the regional term in cultural studies. We are highly honored to have Dr. Chandrima Chakraborty as a resource person for this session. Dr. Chandrima is a professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies and director of the Center for Peace Studies. She was awarded the title of University Scholar at McMaster University in 2017 and was elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists in 2019. She has published widely on masculinity, nationalism, race, and nation-making in Canada, politics, Indian popular cinema. Other than various articles in reviewed journals, she has also published peer-reviewed book chapters, journal essays on post-colonial theory, globalization, religion, nationalism, Canadian multiculturalism, racial violence, racial grief, etc. And presently, she's working on the relationship between race, racism, and current global pandemic issues. She's co-editing a book tentatively titled The Return of Yellow Peril, Anti-Asian Racism During the COVID-19 Pandemic. We are singularly fortunate to have you in our midst, and the postgraduate and research department of English Newman College extend you a very cordial welcome. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I hope you can hear me. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and I will sort of speak along as I share the PowerPoint with you. And the lecture is about the 1985 bombing of Air India Flight 182. The aircraft was called Kanishka, and so it is better known in India as the Kanishka Tragedy. Perhaps some of you have heard about the tragedy if you are young from your parents or grandparents, and some of us maybe who are a bit older perhaps remember it as childhood memories, and perhaps some of our parents or older folks in this conversation might have been there when this tragedy happened. So that is sort of my talk about the work that I have been doing on the Air India. I'm going to share screen and then I will speak along. So as I said, the lecture is about the Kanishka tragedy, and this bombing and its aftermath is a forgotten Canadian and transnational event that has affected three nations, predominantly Canada, Ireland, and India. And I have spent a great deal of my academic career trying to educate Canadians and a global public about this event. And currently at McMaster, where I work, I'm trying to create a digital archive, a memory archive on the Kanishka tragedy. So trying to create a site for memorialization and remembering of this silenced and less remembered historical event. But again, as I said, some of you might be familiar with this story and some of you might not. So I'm going to start with a brief recount. So on June 23rd, 1985, Air India Flight 182 left Toronto Pearson International Airport for Delhi. So it was on its way from Canada to India. And at that time, that is in 1985, there was only one weekly flight that was going here from Toronto. Right? And therefore, the flight had gathered passengers from all over Canada. So you had, people from British Columbia, people from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and, in the eastern side, Halifax, from Nova Scotia. So although the plane left Toronto, there were people from all, almost all of the provinces in Canada who came to Toronto to take this flight. And therefore, this tragedy affects Canadians across Canada. The flight, if you can see on my cursor, was leaving Canada and it was on its way to India. The flight did not make it there. Off the coast of Ireland, here on my screen, off the coast of Ireland, the plane crashed, killing all of the passengers and crew. So it was on its way from Canada, with a stopover in London, going to Delhi and then to Mumbai, but crashed near Cork, Ireland. So that is a footage from the Air India archive. And this is one of the press footage of the plane, or a piece of the aircraft Kanishka near Ahakista, Cork, where it crashed. So why did it crash? Investigations suggest that there were luggage bombs on Air India Flight 182, or what is known as the Kanishka aircraft. And it killed, as I said, all passengers and crew. There were 329 passengers and crew. There was another bomb that was intended for Air India Flight 309. But it detonated while in baggage transfer in Narita International Airport, Tokyo, and 2 baggage handlers were killed. So 331, right? 329 people on flight, crew and passengers, and 2 baggage handlers. So 331 people died in what we now know as the Air India tragedy. So what was the Canadian government's response like? Pre-bombing, before the bombing happened, there were lots of security warnings from India. There were conversations between those who were making the bombs. They were all in British Columbia, and there were lots of conversations between them, which the security agencies recorded, but those tapes were not translated. They were speaking in Punjabi, and those tapes were not translated. Some of the officials also followed the bomb makers as they were testing the bombs, but this was not followed up. So lots of lapses in terms of security, in terms of surveillance. Post-bombing, the Canadian government dismissed this tragedy as a foreign tragedy. Sorry. They dismissed it as a foreign tragedy. As I said, tapes that could have helped to solve this investigation were destroyed. There were 20 years of investigations. This is the longest and most expensive trial in Canadian history. Yet only one person, the bomb maker, was convicted. 2 Sikh residents of British Columbia were put on trial, but then they were acquitted because of the mishandling of evidence by police and security services, along with the lack of cooperation between the police and the security agency. So only one person, the bomb maker, was convicted for manslaughter, and And it was not until 2005 that you had a Canadian Prime Minister visit Ahekista, the memorial where where the plane had crashed. So families for decades felt mistreated. They felt abandoned by their government at a time of need. They felt that they were not supported at this time of grief, loss and suffering. So in my interviews with families who lost loved ones, something that they bring up again and again is their distancing from the Canadian nation. The fact that Canada did not incorporate this tragedy into its collective consciousness. This tragedy has not become part of Canadian public memory, and it has not become part of Canadian history. So the fact that the grief did not seep into the minds or hearts of their fellow Canadians is something that Air India family members, bring up in interviews that I have done with them. However, although, soon after the tragedy, the Canadian government declared it a foreign tragedy, post 9/11, post the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, there have been belated efforts at state memorialization. So Canada has tried to harness the 1985 Air India bombing in the context of a war on terror to demonstrate that Canada has been a victim of terrorism, and also to persuade Canadians to join the United States in its war in Afghanistan. So in 2005, June 23rd was declared as the National Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terrorism. But again, few Canadians remember what this day is for. You don't see much press coverage on June 23rd, although it has been declared as a National Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terrorism. In 2006, the Canadian government established a public inquiry, which was headed by retired Supreme Court Justice John C. Major. On the slide, you see his image, and you see the report that he published in 2010 called Air India Flight 182, A Canadian Tragedy. So the Commission of Inquiry began in 2006. It published its report in 2010. And these are some examples of what the findings of the public inquiry report was. One, that this was a Canadian tragedy. This was not a foreign tragedy. It was a Canadian tragedy. The public inquiry report also said that this is the largest mass murder in Canadian history. And finally, that the government and official agencies were responsible for the tragedy. What John C. Major said in his words, a cascading series of errors by the Canadian government and official agencies had contributed to the Air India tragedy. And soon after this public inquiry report came out, within a few days of the public inquiry report being published, the Prime Minister of the time, Stephen Harper, he offered a public apology on behalf of the federal government. So this was a federal government public apology, and this was delivered at the annual memorial service. And the image that you see on the screen on your left is the memorial site in Toronto, in Humber Bay Park. It's a park in Toronto. And in this park, every year, the families hold a memorial service. A memorial service is held in a number of memorial sites. Small monuments like this are spread out across Canada, as I said, because families across Canada has been affected. So there's a memorial site in Montreal. There is a memorial site in Ottawa. There is a memorial site in Vancouver. But at this Toronto memorial site in 2010, soon after the public inquiry report was published, the Prime Minister of the time offered a public apology. And in this apology, he called it the single worst act of terrorism in Canadian history. And he apologized to the families and friends of those who lost loved ones in the Air India tragedy. And he said, and this is because of the institutional failings of 25 years ago. It took 25 years to offer this public apology. And he apologized for the failings of the government, the failings of the police, the failings of the security agencies, and as well for the mistreatment the treatment of the families in the aftermath of the of this tragedy. So the grief of the Air India tragedy is twofold for family members. One, of course, the loss of family members. Some family members, because it was June 23rd, and that's when in Canada it's vacation time. So lots of children were there on the plane, actually 82 children under the age of 30. Some children were unaccompanied minors. They were traveling to meet their grandparents and cousins and uncles and aunts, and parents were supposed to follow in a week or two. And so you had certain families who lost all their children. There were other families where the mom traveled with the kids and the dad was going to join soon after. So you had, the wife and the children dead. So people lost, husbands and wives and cousins and nephews and nieces. So of course, the real material loss of loved ones. The other loss of the, or grief of the Air India tragedy is the loss of non-recognition as Canadians. So when the Canadian government declared this a foreign tragedy, it distanced Canadians. It did not recognize South Asians or Indians who had, Canadian citizenship or Canadian permanent residence as Canadians. They were seen as belonging elsewhere. So this is what, Clark Blaise and Bharati Mukherjee wrote in their 1987 book. The failure to acknowledge the victims of the crash as Canadians remains for most of the families the enduring political grief of Air India 182. So, Shireen Razak, she is a sociologist professor, and she was the expert witness who was commissioned by the families for the public inquiry report. And in her expert witness testimony, Shireen Razak said, Canadians do not recall June 23rd, 1985. Despite it now being called a Canadian tragedy, Canadians do not recall June 23rd, 1985. As a nation, we were not shaken, transformed, and moved to change our own institutional practices for a tragedy we considered had little to do with us. So this tragedy was seen as foreign. The people that were lost were seen as foreign. The families who continued to mourn this tragedy were seen as foreign. So then what does it mean? What does it mean? What does these belated state memorializations, the creation of monuments, the public inquiry report, a federal government apology, what does this all mean, given that this loss of so many lives has been disavowed for so long as a loss of and for Canada? Right? They were not seen as losses of serious significance to Canada. And this, what you see on my screen, is again an archival footage of the Air India tragedy. So you see, dolls and, pieces of clothing, and you see a piece of the, aircraft floating on the Atlantic. So given the, years of activism by Air India families asking that they're recognized in the public realm so that there be opportunities for public mourning, decades of disrespect, dismissal, and negligence by the government and Canadian official agencies, what does it mean to claim this loss now as Canadian? So what I have argued in my book and elsewhere is that what we see here is an effort at strategic memorialization. So by trying to reclaim this tragedy as Canadian in a post 9/11 context, Canada emerges as a victim of foreign political violence. So those who made the bomb, those who died are mostly, Indians, so racialized immigrants. So the argument by the state is, well, it has got nothing to do with us. We are a peace-loving nation. I know we have welcomed all of these people from India here, and they brought their animosities. They brought their anger, their political feuds to Canada, and therefore this bombing happened. So it is, we are a victim of what these racialized immigrants brought to Canada. And this kind of an argument then, obscures the central role that systemic racism has played in the Air India events. As I noted earlier, there were lots of indication of a bomb being planted on an Air India flight. There were lots of communication from Indian intelligence services, which the Canadian government ignored. So, scholars and families have said, would the government have been so negligent if this was, an Air Canada flight full of primarily white people? What other scholars have also argued is it's not just the bombing, but also post-bombing. How were the families treated? So, seeing it as, Canada as the victim rather than Canada as responsible for what happened, it does not allow us to engage in a conversation about systemic racism and the position of racialized immigrants in Canada. And finally, what this strategic memorialization does is it demands closure. It demands closure from the families. It asks families to move on, forget the past. Yes, we might have been negligent. Yes, we might have been disrespectful. Yes, we might have made some mistakes. But it's all in the past. Let's forget and move on. So it demands closure rather than an engagement with the past. So that is where I think art objects come into play. Because strategic memorializations of the bombings are made much more complex, but also how these losses and the legacies of these losses impact on the wider South Asian community in Canada and beyond. And here are some art objects. So text, a novel like the Kanishka bombing to another racist incident in relation to South Asians in Canada, the Kumagata Maru. And for those of you who do not know, the Kumagata Maru was a ship. This was a ship full of primarily Sikh migrants who came to Canada in 1914. And this is 1914, right? So India was still not independent. So these were all, people holding British passports. So they were coming to Canada, another British colony as British citizens, but they were refused. And they were sent back to India by the Canadian government in an attempt to maintain a white Canada. So both, Badami's novel, Ever After of Ashwin Rao, Vishwanathan's novel, connect the Kanishka bombing to what happened before. So they, the argument that these two novels, for instance, try to make is that the Kanishka bombing is not one secluded or an aberrant event, but there is a long legacy to racism against South Asians in Canada. And these texts also offer a critique of Canadian multiculturalism. The image that you have on the screen on the left-hand side, this is Srinivas Krishna's film Masala. This is one of the first films that referenced the Air India tragedy. And Masala, along with Badami's text and Vishwanathan's text, offer a critique of Canadian multiculturalism. So here, what I'm going to do is just briefly, very briefly, recap or sort of try to explain to you what multiculturalism in Canada entails, and then go back to the Air India tragedy again. So multiculturalism emerged as official government policy in Canada in response to tensions between a white, Anglo-British national core and French Canadians. So there were, tensions between the two, settler subjects in Canada, the British and French, and there were questions about the place of French Canadians within the Confederation. Sorry. There were also concerns about the role of ethnic groups within the Canadian nation. So in relation to these sort of emerging tensions between British, French, and other ethnic groups that were in Canada, as well as indigenous groups, their multiculturalism, was a conversation that began in the 60s and 70s. In 1963, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism was established, and the mandate of the Royal Commission is here. It was to develop the Canadian Confederation on the basis of equal participation between the two founding races, taking into account the contribution made by other ethnic groups. So I'll just pause here and read it again. So the mandate is to develop the Canadian Confederation on the basis of equal participation between two founding races. So the core is still French and British, right? The two founding races. So that is not being shifted when you're talking about multiculturalism. The core of Canadian, citizenship or citizenry is still the two founding races, the settler races, French and British, and then the other ethnic, groups become, add-ons to that. So the two founding charter groups, continue to remain to be French and British. And the racialized, immigrants become sort of in addition to this core subject. So what this charter then does is the original inhabitants of the land. Because again, look at the mandate. The two founding races. Canada was founded by these two settler races. What about the indigenous groups that have preceded the coming of these settler nations? So the erasure of indigenous groups as the original inhabitants of the land continue even as Canada tries to present itself as welcoming of diverse immigrants through its multiculturalism policy. So following this 1963 biculturalism and bilingualism policy, in 1971, multiculturalism became state policy in Canada. And then in 1988, you have the Canadian Multiculturalism Act that recognizes and promotes the understanding that multiculturalism is a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian heritage and identity. And again, pause and take a look at this. What Multiculturalism Act accomplishes here is it suggests that Canada has always already been multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian heritage and identity. It's not saying from 1971 or from 1988 we became multicultural, but it's saying that this is part of Canadian heritage. So we are rewriting the story of Canada through multiculturalism policy. So the notion of Canada as fundamentally multicultural, as welcoming of others, this myth is perpetuated by the Canadian government, yes, but this has also shaped, regular Canadian understanding of their nation, as I said, as always already multicultural. And this has also allowed immigrants to seek out Canada as their immigrant, destination. And then in 1970s, this change in multiculturalism as state policy was also accompanied by changes in immigration policy. So what you have on the slide here is a book, cover, the cover of the book by Ali Kazmi, his book called Undesirables, White Canada and the Kumagata Maru. And again, referencing the Kumagata Maru and the efforts to maintain a white Canada. So in the 1970s, when multiculturalism becomes state policy, there is also change in policy. There is a liberalization of non-white immigrants. So from a white Canada policy, there is an elimination of racial distinctions in immigration policy, and then you have immigrants from South Asia, Africa, Caribbean, coming to Canada in the 1970s. So what did multiculturalism, as state policy accompanied by the liberalization of immigration policy achieve? So first, it allowed Canada to differentiate itself from the United States. So while the United States, metaphor is that of a melting pot. So anybody comes in from elsewhere, it's like, you're creating, a soup. So all of these people come in from different places, and then you pot them together and you mash it, all up, and you have a melting pot. But Canada sees itself as different, not a melting pot. The metaphor that is used in Canada is that of a mosaic, or like, a salad bowl, where you have, your carrots, and you have your, cucumbers, and you have your onions and your tomatoes, and they all have their distinct flavors. You can see all of them, you can taste each of them. They all add to the core. They all, add to the flavors, enhance the flavors of the country, but they are not melted together. In other words, Canada values diverse cultures, right? It wants the coexistence of difference and cultural practices. The second thing that multiculturalism accomplished was it helped Canada to reinvent itself from a white settler colony to a multiracial, multi-ethnic, liberal, democratic society. So Canada's reinvention of itself is made possible through multiculturalism, and it appears as multi-ethnic, multiracial, and so forth. And finally, what it did was that it had the dual effect of the adoption of multiculturalism as state policy and liberal immigration policy allowed for the material inclusion of increased number of immigrants, meaning lots of immigrants came into the country, to Canada, but it also simultaneously excluded them from belonging to the nation. So while you have an increase of racialized immigrants in the country as workers, as taxpayers, there is simultaneous distancing from them as belonging to the nation. So, constant questions or recurring questions that racialized immigrants, whether they're first generation or third generation in Canada, get is, where are you from? And if they say, well, I am from Toronto, or I was born in Canada, they will ask, well, but where are your parents from? Where are your, grandparents from? So there's a constant, understanding that if you are racialized, you come from elsewhere. But if you are white, right, it doesn't matter when you came, what your generational belonging to Canada is, you are, automatically Canadian. So what official, multiculturalism has also made possible in terms of Canadian, nationalist history and public memory is that it has become a tool to manage. A tool to manage minorities and their racial grief. So what Canadian multiculturalism has made possible is that it has resulted in the erasure, in the silencing of inconvenient and difficult past. Past such as the air tragedy, past such as Kumagamaru, past such as the Chinese head tax, right? So it has resulted in the marginalization of people's grief, people's memories and grievances. And the Canadian government, sort of this myth of Canada, then does not allow the government or educational institutions to examine different population groups in the context of the long histories of racial violence in Canada. It also puts forward an image of the model migrant who is also expected to be the model mourner. And what do I mean by that? And this is a term that I use in my book, The Art of Public Mourning, Remembering Air India, where I put forward this theory of it's not just good enough being a model migrant, meaning speaking English or having a job or paying your taxes, but also mourning these griefs and grievances in a civil way, right? Not being too belligerent and not holding on to your grievances, because the Canadian government is impatient with minorities who hold on to these experiences of grief and suffering, and who hold on to these memories of loss, who continue to grieve, who continue to hold on to the past, whether it's loss, pain, or anger. And the model migrant is expected to be the model mourner, to forget, to move on, and thus help the state to cover up a history of racism, negligence, and disrespect. So, when we are talking of the art of, public mourning, or when we are talking of the different art objects in relation to the state's, efforts at strategic memorialization, Judith Butler comes to mind, where she says that the frame does not simply exhibit reality. So the frame of multiculturalism, right? The frame of understanding Canada as a multicultural nation, that it is welcoming, that it is inclusive, that it is tolerant, it's open to minorities. Frames such as this does not simply exhibit reality, but actively participates in a strategy of containment. It constrains what we can see. It creates, it draws those, with markers, if you're using a marker, and it draws those lines, those boxes, right? The frames that you see, the window frames here, it tells you where the window ends, like how far you can peek out, how far you can see. And it helps to selectively produce and enforce what will count as reality. So what art as public mourning does is it disrupts, right? It disrupts the nationalist frame. It disrupts the frame of nationalist history by alerting us, by reminding us of those that have borne the burden of racial discrimination, exclusion, and negligence. Those that continue to remember, those that continue to mourn the losses of the Air India tragedy, even as the state has forgotten them or wants to forget them. And so that's where, my work, sort of comes into play. As I've mentioned at the beginning, I'm trying to create, a memory archive at McMaster Library, which is where I work. And the effort is to bring into public vision the hazily remembered Air India tragedy and make accessible, difficult knowledge or forgotten knowledge or difficult knowledge or, or inconvenient history, in other words, right? And so through decolonial archival practices, the aim is to create new forms of public history. And so what do I mean by decolonial archival practices? Meaning not giving primacy to just text-based knowledge, or not giving primacy to documents produced by the state, right, such as the public inquiry report or the federal government apology, or the prime minister's memos and briefs, etc., but also including images, photographs, scrapbooks, interviews. So looking at knowledge as testimony, so that we can open up space for community and not just official state documents. And by bringing these kinds of documents within the archive, by giving them visibility, this is going to be a digital archive, free and accessible globally. It can become a way to enact a form of justice, right? A memory justice for those who have been forgotten, those who died in the tragedy, and those who continue to remember the tragedy. So in creating this archive, this is sort of my perspective, that while personal proximity to the losses of the Air India bombings must be privileged, meaning those who lost a husband, a wife, a child, a niece, or a nephew, those kinds of proximity to losses must be maintained and privileged. But the attempt also is to broaden a sense of inheritance, a sense of responsibility to care for the impact of the bombings, and to care for the impact of the bombings not only in terms of what happened in the past, but the continuing memorial insistence that these bombings make on our shared present and future. So what I'm going to do is in the next few slides show you some of the materials that are going to be part of the archive. So the archival collection will comprise of interviews that I'm doing with family members, first responders, journalists who followed the story from 1985 and continues to follow the story, personal artifacts contributed by family members, such as scrapbooks, memorial books, drawings, published and unpublished artwork. So creative work that can make visible the grief, the ongoing loss of this tragedy. So this is a piece that I wrote in the conversation, Canada in 2018, talking about Canada's troubling indifference to the Air India bombing. And the image that you see here is of Ratan Singh Khalsi, and the image that he is of him, holding a photograph, that is his daughter, 18-year-old Indira Khalsi. So I interviewed Ratan Khalsi. He has passed away since. He's no more with us. He passed 2 years ago. And Ratan Khalsi, I know he was in an elderly home when I interviewed him. He was unwell, and I interviewed him. And in his interviews, it appeared that as if 1985 was the night before. It happened the night before. The loss of his daughter, as if it happened the night before. This is a man who felt responsible, felt guilty of murdering his daughter. So Indira Khalsi, who was 18, was just going to begin a job, and Ratan Khalsi bought a ticket for her to go to meet grandparents. Ratan's mom was unwell, and so he wanted Indira, the granddaughter, to go and visit her, because she was starting a new job and she might not get a vacation very soon. So he bought a ticket and put her on the plane. Indira didn't want to go; she wanted to go together with the family. And this was the ill-fated Air India Flight 182. Indira Khalsi was killed, and Ratan never forgave himself till the day he died. And here is an image of, as you can see, it's a handwritten note. So a few weeks before Ratan Khalsi was, very ill and he was in palliative care, his living sons, right? They were packing up all his things in the elderly home, and they found this note, and I will read this note out to you. They found this note in an urn. Ratan Khalsi's wife, Harbhajan, had passed 2 years ago, and in that urn where the mother's ashes were, they found this note, and this is the handwritten note. When I am gone, mix my ashes with Harbhajan's ashes and take them to Ireland. Go with fishermen and put ashes in Atlantic, and it's signed as Ratan Khalsi. So this was a note that the children found, a few days before their dad died, and they promised their dad that this is what we are going to do. And then on the right, what you see is a paper cutting from Irish Times where they are reporting about what the children did. So the children did exactly what their dad wanted. So they took their mom's ashes, they took their dad's ashes, they took it to Ireland, to a Hakista. They got in a boat. They went as far in the Atlantic as they could, and they immersed those ashes in the Atlantic. So even at death, this was his dying wish, that he be put as close to his dead daughter as possible, right? The daughter that, 37 years ago, 38 years ago, had perished on the Atlantic. So these are some of the, archival materials. This is Lata Pada. She is a famous, Bharatnatyam dancer. And she lost, she's holding the photograph of her 2 daughters and her husband. So she lost her 2 daughters and her husband in the Kanishka bombing. And Lata stopped dancing. She was a famous dancer. She ran an academy close to Toronto. She stopped dancing for 10 years after she lost her daughters because they were accomplished Bharatnatyam dancers, and she just couldn't get back to dancing. But then finally, Lata found, solace in dance. In 2001, she created a dance drama called Revealed by Fire. And this is, the image that you see. This is the book cover of our book. And this is Lata Pada's dance drama cover that we used as the cover of her book, where in this Revealed by Fire, Lata Pada tells of her story of being in Mumbai, practicing for a dance rehearsal. And she was already in Mumbai, and her husband and 2 daughters were going to join her. They were in the Kanishka flight, and the phone rings, and she receives this news, and what it means for her to be a widow, a young widow, and what does it mean for her to dance, and what it meant for her to come back to dance. So in my interviews with her, Lata says that and it was hard to go back to dance, but when I teach dancing, somebody twirls their hair in a particular way, or somebody moves their hands in a particular gesture, and I can see bits and fragments of my daughter. And that makes, dance a way to move forward, a way to live. This is Renee Satlikar, and she wrote a collection of elegies called The Children of Air India. This is, Renee reading from her Children of Air India. And in this collection of elegies, Children of Air India, what Renee does is she writes a poem each for the 82 children who perished on Air India Flight 182. And Renee here, tries to tell the story of these Air India children who are, seen as numbers, or, dead body not found, or, information redacted redacted from the government documents. She tries to create these children as living, as flourishing, human beings. So she takes on the role of witness. She takes on the role of, archivist, raising compelling questions around official archives, unofficial archives, official narratives of the story, of the tragedy, unofficial narratives of the tragedy. And in doing so, she, underlines the unacknowledged, the marginalized grief of Air India, families. And Renee Saklikar, lost her uncle and aunt on the Air India tragedy. Her uncle and aunt were visiting her family, and which meant, their only son, who was in India at the time, Irfan, was rendered an orphan. So that's her. And this is a docudrama, Desperately Seeking Helen, created by Isha Marjara. Isha Marjara lost her mom and her sister in the Kanishka Tragedy. And in this docudrama, what she does is she shares erased stories of her mother's, immigrant life in Canada. So not just her death, but her life in Canada, what it meant to be a Punjabi-speaking, woman who wants to be an English teacher, but speaks in, heavily accented Punjabi, can't find a job. What does it mean for her to live in a small town in Quebec, which is a very cold, icy, snowy town, not have family, not have friends, and what does her death mean now that she's gone? Isha Marjara's, mom's body was found at the tragedy, and what Isha has then done, she's also a photographer, is that she's created some photo montages, and what you see here is Isha in the background, and this is her mom's, fractured skull that was found. And so drawing upon, framework of memory, of oral history, she's trying to organize the work of archiving here, right? And she is, trying to tell this story. So here you have that skull, and here is again hair that was found, and she calls this image tangle, so that a tangled story of, you see her mother's image, you see her in the foreground, and at the back what you can see, this is a clock, this is a watch, sorry, this is the watch that her mother was wearing, and it stopped when the plane crashed, right? So she uses all of these images again to make visible the grief, the ongoingness of the grief, and trying to tell the story. So what all of these images, such as Marjara's, I hope will offer is an opportunity to assess how artistic projects engaging with the official Air India archive lead us to rethink what we mean by data, evidence and research methods in archival practice. Because here what we have is artists taking on the role of witnesses and archivists, right? So the Air India archive that I'm creating will function as a form of counter archive to official national archives, and it will trouble the written bias of archival records. So some other examples, this is a journal, and these are two brothers who were on the flight and perished. And this is he's in grade 7, and as you can imagine, this journal tells of his desires. There are poetry, etc. So this is his journal that the family then published after the children were gone. This is a memorial book by the Khalsi family. I talked about Ratan Khalsi, and this is a memorial book. It's about 200 pages, and it has photos right from 1985 to 2019, because almost every year the family used to go to this Hakista Memorial in Ireland. So again, a memorial book. Also newspaper cuttings such as this will make it into the archive. And so what this archive then aims to do is to offer testimony, to offer an argument that what has happened as in relation to the Air India tragedy is not an exceptional event or an aberrant event or one monumental example of structural racism and discrimination endured by racialized minorities in Canada, but that the Air India archive is an example of minority history. It offers us community memory. And this minority archive can challenge the state's management of grief. right? Remembering this event from the perspective, not just the event, but also the aftermath, right? And what came before, so pre-event and post-event. Remembering, this series of events from the perspective of the families and the communities will display the emotional labor of minorities who hold on to loss, grief, pain, who remember to accept the state's push for closure. So what they do then, or I hope they will do, is acknowledge and articulate publicly the everyday grief, the everyday grievance and racial violence that continues. So the aim, and my final slide, so the aim of the area in the archive is to move us beyond, the frame of family memory, to move us beyond those who lost loved ones, by demonstrating the effects of the tragedy on others. So it broadens, the hope is to broaden the faces and voices of an engaged and interested public. It asks us to be responsive and be responsible for the past and the ongoingness of the past in the present. And over more than a decade, through my teaching, through my research, through my publications, and through public talks such as these, I have been working to bring into public vision this hazily remembered Air India tragedy, and in trying to make accessible this inconvenient or lesser known history, the hope is to transform Canadian public memory and consequently, Canadian history, so that we can think of these experiences of loss as both historically significant and as a shared loss. So that's where I will, end here, and thank you.
Now, the session is open for discussion. If you have any questions, you may raise it now. You can also comment your questions on the comment section. Should be read out by us. Judith Butler.
So the participants can write their queries in the chat box if you want. Otherwise, you can unmute and ask the questions directly to the speaker. Ma'am, first of all, let me make a comment. It was a well-crafted session, and I would like to ask a question. You were talking about the art of public mourning. So, is there something called the art of forgetting in the in the responses from the authority? It's what I feel when you talk about the approaches from the authorities regarding the tragedy, the way in which they treated the people. So is there an art of forgetting from their part?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question, because you have to look at creative art, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. Look at artistic practices, because there has been a long art of forgetting. Right? It is because that this particular event and its aftermath has not found a place in Canadian public memory. It has not entered in Canadian public consciousness that we have to look beyond official documents, beyond official ways of telling the story, right? So I think those are directly connected, both forgetting and remembering, because even when the state, as I talked about it, even when the state is remembering, it's a strategic remembering. Right? It's remembering to create this narrative that we have also been victims of terrorism, so we have to participate in the war on terror. It is not remembering because it has now realized that it has forgotten the story of this community and their grief, right? So it is not remembering to tell the story and to acknowledge the grief of these, families who are of Indian origin, right? So definitely directly connected that how forgetting and remembering, and even when we remember, right, we remember selectively. When we forget selectively. So those are both connected, absolutely.
Ma'am, I want to add one more thing to that. When you were talking about this, what I was feeling that nowadays we have a Canadian dream instead of an American dream. We have a Canadian dream, especially from the young generation of India. They have a dream to go to Canada. So just Canada has, by forgetting such an event, amidst its liberal multicultural policy, or within quotation marks, within multicultural policy, whether they are having a political motive or whether they are having an economic motive behind such a kind of purposeful forgetting.
Yeah, so maybe there are two parts to the question, I guess. So one is sort of the younger generation who are looking towards Canada. Actually this month there was a news report by the Auditor General that international students from India is the largest number of international students in Canada. Before it was China. So the largest number of international students coming to Canada are coming from India. And so what has also happened is, post-secondary enrollment in Canadian, particularly colleges, not as much in universities, have decreased. And so the Canadian, government is also looking at India, where international students pay 3 times more the fees to come to Canada, right? So having one international student allows them to manage the at least the fees of 4 domestic students. So international students have become unfortunately a cash cow, where they are coming to Canada in colleges which often don't have proper accreditation, etc. But then often, Canada is, you talked of the Canadian dream, but that is also in relation to the American dream, right? The American dream seems to have been completely fractured thanks to Donald Trump and, the rising COVID numbers and everything else that's happened in the United States, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, violence against, Black, brown, Asian bodies. So Canada in that sense, offers definitely a better alternative. So lots of immigrants come to Canada as sort of look to Canada as their immigrant destination. The other sort of aspect of your question in terms of the political motive behind forgetting, well, it's all nations. It's not specific to Canada, right? If you think of India, I mean, do we really talk about the partition? Do we have something? We talk about independence. We talk about independence from colonial rule. We celebrate Gandhi and Nehru and others. But we talk about the extreme violence against Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs? Do we talk about the rape? Do we talk about the trauma on female bodies, the abduction, the displacement, the question of children, orphans as a result of the partition, the Dalits during the partition? So each nation tries to craft a narrative that allows them to produce or sort of put forward this unified picture. We don't want to talk of inconvenient stories. So in India, we are okay talking about national independence and marching in front of the Red Fort and hoisting our flags and doing our Bharatanatyam and our Kuchipudi and Mohiniyattam and whatnot, but we are not okay talking about the violence against women. We are not okay talking about the torture of women and children, etc. So it is there are reasons why states forget. Also, there is worries that if you bring up this difficult pasts, it will create more animosities because those communities are continuing to coexist, and therefore bringing up this difficult pasts will force them to relive those memories, and therefore it will not result in a secular coexistence. And that's similar to what Canada's thinking is, that yes, these were wrongs, these were terrible things that happened, whether it's Komagata Maru, whether it's Chinese head tax, whether it is what has happened in schools, in residential schools run by the Catholic Church against indigenous children. But those are all our pasts, and we it's better to forget, right? But who has the privilege to forget, right? If you have lost a son, if you've lost a daughter, do you really have the privilege to forget? Can you really forget? So again, it depends on who has the power to tell the story, who has the power to narrativize the story in a particular way. And that's where sort of, creative artists, many of who are family members and others who are not, have tried to raise those questions. About forgetting. So yes, there are political motives. There are culture, different kinds of motives between, not just by how the state remembers, but also how communities remembers, right? So for example, Sikh communities remembering the story, or if you are a Khalistani sympathizer remembering the story, would be different perhaps from Ratan Khalsi, who is also Sikh and who has lost his daughter remembering the story. So there are multiple angles. I think I saw a question on chat. Somebody's saying, can you use a headphone? I guess it's too late, isn't it? Somebody's asking a question. Do you think even Indians residing in India have forgotten this incident? What were their perspective on this tragedy back then and now? Yeah, I guess the answer to that question would be, how close are you to the community? Like, do you know somebody who has lost somebody on that tragedy? Are you part of the community? So I'll give you an example. Say, for instance, Padma Vishwanathan or Anita Rao Badami, whose novels I referenced. They did not lose somebody on the tragedy, right? But they are aware of the story, having grown up in Canada. Padma Vishwanathan was born and brought up here from Edmonton, Alberta. Badami immigrated to Canada much later, and they are still telling the story. So it depends on where you are, where your thinking are, what kinds of things you read, right? So what is sort of within your interest. There hasn't been much press coverage on the Air India tragedy in the past, but things have changed in the last, I would say, 7 or 8 years. There is, more coverage of the Air India tragedy. Last year, when the Ukrainian crash happened, there was a lot of coverage that came up, talking about the Air India tragedy in relation to the Iranian crash. So there is, better awareness. And lots of, members of the Indian community has been at the forefront of, activism, asking for remuneration, asking for, grief counseling, asking for other kinds of needs, and talking about the needs of those who lost loved ones. Not directly, but also maybe, it was a classmate, it was a friend, it was somebody who was your neighbor. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for answering.
Excuse me, ma'am. I have a question.
Sure, please.
Hello, I'm Andrew from Newman. I'm a PhD student at Newman College. So my question is this: is Canada really a good Samaritan attitude towards its neighbors and other foreigners, a facade against its neighbor, its powerful neighbor, America? Do you think so?
Can you repeat it for me? Your voice was cutting a bit.
Is America's is Canada's good Samaritan attitude towards its foreign dwellers or diaspora and other migrants a facade to get supremacy over its powerful neighbor America? What's your opinion on that?
I don't think so. I don't think it's a facade. I think it's how nations work, and this is not specific to Canada. Canada, does value diverse, cultures. There is a, real interest in terms of, maintaining this understanding of Canada as a mosaic, as multicultural, as a place for diverse cultures to come in. And to give you, a recent example, you have all seen, I'm sure with newspaper coverage with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, the anti-Asian racism that we've seen both in Canada and in United States, the response has been very different, right? While in the United States, you had Donald Trump, calling it Chinese virus, right? Flu virus, Wuhan virus, despite the World Health Organization repeatedly asking national governments not to identify any kinds of infectious diseases by ethnicity or their place of origin, right? Donald Trump disregarded that advice and continued to do so. And some of the work that Asian scholars have done, it shows that soon after his press report about Wuhan virus, Chinese virus, you had thousands. I think about 4,000 cases of anti-Asian violence, slurs, people being pushed, people being spit on in the United States. Now, look at that same thing happening in Canada. You had not as much of a rise in anti-Asian violence, but you also saw similar things happening in Canada. And you saw also the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, coming up and saying, this is not us. These are Canadians. This is not, what is happening is not right. It needs to stop. And you had community organizations coming together to fight anti-Asian racism. So I definitely do not think that this is a facade. Canada, despite all its problems, is definitely not United States.
Thank you. Do we have any advice?
And then maybe, I'll just, because Andrew, you asked it, maybe I will also just add, this facade of, multiculturalism or, diversity, it's not very different in terms of what we saw in India, right? In India, with COVID-19, the violence against Muslims, how is that any different? The misinformation about Muslims spreading the coronavirus and the violence against minorities in India. So not very different. So each country seems to be able to find a scapegoat, right? And the scapegoat always seems to be a religious minority, a ethnic minority, a racialized minority. But the mainstream always seems to be able to find a scapegoat. So I don't think it's very different.
Ma'am, but the Indian scenario have them as natives, not migrants, or not as we are the ones who are living in India are a necessity of the nation. That's what the constitution says. So I don't think at that level that they have it.
Well, immigrants in Canada will say the same thing. We have citizenship. We belong here. Many of those of the Indian diaspora here are third, fourth generation, right? I talked about the Kumagata Maru. So, there were, Indian immigrants in Canada right from the 1900s. So are they any less native, right? But if you ask the Hindu, right, they might have a very different story to tell about, Muslims, whether they are native or whether, they have to live elsewhere. So again, depends on who is spinning the story, right? What is the narrative being told? If you are second, third, fourth, fifth generation Indian in Canada, are you Indian? Are you Canadian? When is the timeline, right? How many hundreds of years do you have to be here to be native?
Yes, to that I agree. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more queries? Thank you, ma'am. We are winding up the discussion session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Once again, good evening to one and all. The duty that is vested on my shoulders this evening is to propose gratitude to all those who have contributed to the smooth and successful content of all the sessions that we have had on this day. We began with the inaugural session in the morning and then moved on to bigger presentation sessions that were staged quite along pre-exercising sessions. We have had around 75 paper presenters across 11 sessions and will continue to do so in the coming weeks too. Let me move on to my responsibility for the session. For the past 1.5 hours, we have been hearing from Dr. Chandrima Chakraborty on the Art of Public Mourning based on the 1985 Kanishka Tragedy. On factual basis, she explained to us how multiculturalism was adopted as a state policy by the Canadian government and the accomplishments by adopting such a policy. I take this opportunity to express my gratitude on behalf of the Department of English of Newman College, Tdpza, to you, madam, for taking out time from your busy schedule to be with us this day. Thank you, madam. We in the department have a head that is always quite straight, the harbor where all the ships can be docked. Thank you, Dr. Vijay madam, for being with us for this session. I thank you, the organizer of this conference, Ms. Enjoy Maria Joseph, all the teachers in the department, undergraduate and postgraduate students for all the support rendered. Of course, how can I wonder the word of thanks without thanking the technical committee who have been working all over the day for this hassle-free streaming. Last but not least, I express my gratitude to all those who have joined us from across the globe. We are taking a break for now and join us back for the keynote lecture tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. by Dr. Art of Public Mourning on Deciphering Region, Dismembering Regional Literature. And on that note, we are winding up the session for today. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. This from is a personal thought saying, system being with the on. Can you hear?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's cutting out a bit. Yes, I can.
So my sister is being the one.
Yes, I know her well.
Okay. You're doing well now?
Sorry?
Are you doing well? Everything
I can't hear you. Yes, everything is well.
So little bit snowfall and all, and this Omicron virus is spreading faster, I heard.
Yes, it is spreading a lot. So everything is online still, and there are new restrictions and lockdown restrictions in terms of restaurants, schools, and colleges. So it's all online. Yeah.
Okay. You did well. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity to share my work with you. Thanks so much.
I heard a lot from Newman about you.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Bye.